Chapter 14. The Division of the Laboratory. For exactly 1 year after Buteyko's PhD oral defense, Professor Pomeykin endured having the consulting room next to his. As it turned out, he didn't have to put up with it for longer than that. A schemer by nature, he dragged the institute down so far that it was on the verge of total collapse. Nasty rumours, conspiracy and intrigue gripped everyone under his management. By now, they were not just at odds with Buteyko, they were daggers drawn amongst themselves. The warring factions mainly fell into 3 camps: the surgeons, with Professor Pomeykin at their head, the theoreticians, headed by Professor Milman, and the physiologists. All 3 groups slugged it out for one and the same thing: the right to total mastery of the Institute for Experimental Medicine, and they aimed straight for the head. A whole stream of backbiting letters did the rounds of all the higher government bodies, including the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party. The theoreticians assured the government that Pomeykin was blinded by blood and surgery, at which he undoubtedly outshone most other practitioners, that he was indiscriminating and had forgotten about real science. He was chasing after transitory, short-term results right there on the operating table in front of him, and paid no heed to basic medical research. The surgeons informed on the theoreticians, making out they had their heads in the clouds, and were throwing public money to the winds with their endless delving into dusty archives that brought not an ounce of good to any one of their patients. The physiologists slagged off them both. One after another state commission visited the institute. It seemed the offending parties would never stop screaming, squabbling and scandalizing, and since the institute was part of the Siberian branch of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the responsibility for keeping it in order fell naturally on its president first and foremost. Academician Lavrentiev was no fool by any means. On his fairly frequent visits to the institute with other presidium members, he registered quite quickly that only one laboratory took no part in the internecine fighting that was tearing the scientific group apart, and that was Buteyko's laboratory of functional diagnostics. It was not as if it was in separate premises, far from it. It felt the heat from all the warring factions, right, left, and centre, especially Pomeykin's, but it did not react. Waves of vituperation broke on the laboratory's thin partition walls, but that was where they ended. Behind them, people went about their heavy daily caseload. Even outsiders realized that the staff who worked there just did not have time for infighting. From morning to night, they were busy with their own important responsible work for all to see, unlike other units. The President's conversations with patients were conclusive confirmation. Academician Lavrentiev did not usually take impulsive decisions, but once he had made up his mind about something quite firmly, he acted. He summoned Buteyko to a meeting of the Regional Communist Party Executive Committee, and in the presence of Party Secretary Petrov, himself invited him to become director of the institute. Just for one tiny second, something quivered in the doctor's soul. The directorship would open unseen possibilities for him to promote his method. No one would dare wall up the patient's door to the laboratory again, and their jackets and fur coats would no longer lie in a heap on the filthy floor. He'd be able to spend significantly more on the laboratory and expand his staff. He would be able to get new premises. He couldn't count all the things he would be able to do if he accepted the post. However, like many other honourable and intelligent people, Buteyko did not lust for power. Their work is far more precious to them, and often they take decisions that undermine it. "No, I won't," Buteyko said categorically, discomfited by the thoughts that suddenly swept over him. "Why ever not?" Lavrentiev asked, with obvious displeasure and ill-concealed alarm, drumming the fingers of his left hand on the polished tabletop nervously. "Irreconcilable enemies are at each other's throats in the Institute," Buteyko said quietly, speaking slightly slower. I have neither the time nor the opportunity to try to reconcile them. In my view, it's a completely useless exercise." He fell silent and waited for their reaction. Blushing slightly, Party Secretary Petrov coughed into his fist. "For me, it's far more important to continue our research on the combined complexator with no interruptions, which is what I am doing at the moment." "Well, you would hold all the cards." The academician jerked at the last remark. "Become director, and nothing will get in your way." After failing to get a positive answer from Buteyko, a short while later, Academician Lavrentiev convened an urgent meeting of the Presidium of the Siberian branch of the Soviet Academy of Sciences to resolve the situation in the Institute for Experimental Medicine once and for all. There was a possibility that Professor Pomyekin's whole establishment would be closed down and dismantled. The professor's ubiquitous spy network had informed him of Buteyko's serious talk with the Communist Party secretary. Pomyekin was terribly put out. He'd put so much hard work into ousting Danny the Dreamer, so much effort and energy, just to have him as director. That Pomyekin just could not stomach. It meant all his misgivings had been true. It was not the theoreticians, not the Millmans and others that blocked his way, but Buteyko, so quiet, so diligent, so dedicated to his science. On the outside, they must be joking. No one had ever managed to take Professor Pomyekin for a ride. Just 3 hours before Academician Lavrentiev's presidium met, Professor Pomyekin summoned Buteyko to his consulting rooms. Dull October sun cast a cold light over the director's office. "You have no place in a surgical institute with your respiratory research." Screwing his watery eyes tight with the effort, Professor Pomyekin made a direct hit. "It would be most logical if you resigned." Though his manner was mild, Dr Buteyko could also hit a winner even when he'd been taken off guard. "We still don't know which of us will have to resign." At this the professor even sat down. "I will work wherever I feel I'm needed." The doctor could feel his jaw set. For the moment there was deadly silence in the consulting room. An old, intractable argument was drawing to a close. "Listen to him. He really is aiming to be director," Pomyekin thought. What an unpleasant, androgynous mug the man has," Buteyko found himself thinking, incensed. "For the time being, I am still boss around here," Pomyekin shouted, red with anger, at the doctor's receding back. "It's my institute, mine, and no one else's." As he pulled the door to behind him, Buteyko shrugged ambiguously, as though at a loss to understand. If Professor Pomyekin had not gone so fiercely on the attack, possibly Buteyko would not have spoken at the Presidium. He would have let the theoreticians and surgeons have a go at each other's throats, because the doctor did not like getting embroiled in all their infighting. And although the professor put down the work of his laboratory more than any others, it was unlikely Dr Buteyko would have spoken from the podium. But Professor Pomyekin had been smarting with suspicion and scared to death of losing his throne. He had riled Buteyko too far by threatening to sack him. "I shall say something," Buteyko thought, "but I won't be the first. I'll give the fighters a chance to work off some steam." But alas, the fighters did not turn up at the meeting. The Millmans and Shikmans were only good at scribbling denunciations to the Communist Party Central Committee. When a sullen academician Lavrentiev invited anyone with a complaint about the institute to express their views directly, an awkward silence descended on the hall. The leader of the theoreticians studied Lenin's portrait with exaggerated interest, and the leader of the physiologists began examining the toe caps of his polished boots. The president waited. "Surely somebody wants to say something." He adjusted the parliamentarian's insignia on the lapel of his immaculate dark suit. "After so many letters, so many complaints." Lavrentiev glanced in the direction of Professor Milman, shaved close as a billiard ball, and for some reason suddenly embarrassed. "That's strange, comrades." The academician improvised, somewhat at a loss. "We have come together here to speak frankly." "May I?" Buteyko flung up his right hand sharply. "Be my guest." Academician Lavrentiev leant towards the microphone with pleasure. "I give the floor to Professor Buteyko." In the heat of the moment, he exaggerated Buteyko's status. As he mounted the stage, Buteyko noticed how Pomyekin's womanish face had fallen, completely ashen. As he faced the expectant hall, he suddenly thought, "So much for your underhand skullduggery. Always the invisible string-puller." His glance paused for a moment on Professor Milman, the leader of the theoreticians' group, whose face had immediately brightened. He began to speak, improvising as he went along. "When we were back in Moscow, and Professor Pomyekin shared his plans with me for developing our institute, he called it a medical biological institute. It was to embrace a whole complex of serious scientific research, encompassing issues at the margins of contemporary medicine and biology. It was intended to put research into gaps in human physiology at a proper level, to refine functional diagnostics that remain crude even to this day, and to carry out profound theoretical groundwork. But what do we have today?" He jerked his head at the hall. Professor Milman, an imposing figure in the third row, shrugged his shoulders and rolled indignant eyes heavenwards. "In the few years that have passed since then, Professor Pomyekin has managed to forget all about the plans he himself had," Buteyko said sonorously. "With amazing ability, not to say intrinsic cynicism and deviousness, the director has transformed a leading research institute into the drabbest, most third-rate municipal clinic." The doctor turned to Pomyekin, who was trembling under the onslaught. He tried to get to his feet, but Lavrentiev gestured him to stay where he was. "You may say that a municipal clinic does not do heart surgery," Buteyko continued, increasingly getting into his stride. "But what do you call an institute that gives you only one branch of common or garden medicine, basically heart surgery, instead of in-depth academic research into medical biology on a solid theoretical and practical basis as promised? A branch of medicine led and doggedly promoted by Professor Pomyekin. There is no question about it. It is an important and necessary branch of medicine. But if so, why dress it up in broader scientific language and under its cover get into the Siberian branch of the Academy of Sciences?" Behind Pomyekin, the hall began to applaud Buteyko. "An establishment with a purely surgical profile, and a cardiosurgical one at that, should be part of the Ministry of Health, and not living off the Academy of Sciences." Buteyko adjusted his microphone. "Or else Professor Pomyekin and his surgeons will grow fat, while the physiologists and theoreticians waste away more each day." He said much more at that meeting, and spoke for 30 minutes. Cheered by his support, Dr. Milman wiped his hands fiercely. Pomyekin was simply a terrible sight. He was so angry with Buteyko, he looked fit to burst. With mathematical precision, citing incontrovertible facts, Buteyko proved that the root of all the misfortunes befalling the Institute was its director. As he drew to a close, he proposed that Pomyekin and his surgical brigade be reassigned from the Academy of Sciences to the Ministry of Health, and all the research staff left in position. Professor Pomyekin looked sick as a dog at that point. It was a long time since he'd had a kicking like that, and by someone he'd been trying to grind to a pulp for years. Anyone other than Buteyko would probably have drunk himself to death or left, and there were many examples of both. But now they were expelling a candidate for the Nobel Prize like some mangy dog, and doing it at the suggestion of Danny the Dreamer. The decision to remove the Pomyekin faction from the Academy of Sciences was adopted by overwhelming majority. The director's opponents could celebrate a victory, but only a partial one. They had got Pomyekin out of the Academy of Sciences, but removing him there and then from the Institute's premises was impossible. That required time. Meanwhile, to all intents and purposes, everything remained as before, except that a group of Pomyekin's opponents was formally attached to the Institute of Genetics and Cytology, which was housed in the same building. They included Dr Buteyko and his laboratory. Attached they might be, but the victims could not be protected from their tyrant straight away. He was still there after all, next door in his old rooms, with all his old ambitions and unreasonable demands. And before the institute was broken up, Professor Pomyekin announced that he too needed a laboratory of functional diagnostics like that of the hated Dr Buteyko, and they would need to divide it up. It was divided in an extremely idiosyncratic way. Of his 50 staff, Dr Buteyko was left with 12. Pomyekin was even more cavalier with the priceless equipment for the combine complexator that Buteyko had personally helped acquire and assemble. He simply gave instructions for most of it to be dragged into his half of the building, and did so on the sly, as always, while the doctor was absent on an urgent work trip. An avenging angel had gripped Pomyekin's heart. Revenge. At all costs he wanted to punish Danny the Dreamer severely for the division. And what could be worse for a scientific inventor than being deprived of the skilled assistance and apparatus essential for scientific research? He hadn't managed to get rid of Danny the Dreamer physically, though he had tried everything he could, but he could still destroy him morally. What would the little upstart do when he got back from his trip, fired up about his breathing therapy, to find his laboratory almost empty, and his staff reduced to a quarter? Pomyekin kicked the expensive capnograph that faithful Mutin had carted into his office for temporary safekeeping. "Did you say the Buteyko people measured the body's carbon dioxide content with this crappy machine?" the professor asked crudely, in reply to Mutin's quizzical look. "Buteyko got it for hard currency from a Dutch firm," Mutin answered willingly. "And have we left him many pieces of apparatus like that?" Pomyekin asked with faked interest, having personally supervised the stripping of the laboratory. "No, virtually none." Mutin wiped his face with the palm of his right hand, hung over from the night before, and so looking blearier than ever. "But you can't just clear everything out," he cautioned. "We don't need to," Pomyekin said, walking over to his desk and starting to sift through the documents on it. "We don't need to clear out everything. We'll do everything by the book." He took out a comb and carefully combed the top of his head, where the hair was visibly thinning. "Something's got to go to him, and something's got to go to us." He had absolutely no need of the capnograph, like much of what he had confiscated from Buteyko. He was not planning to measure the CO2 levels of his patients, but Pomyekin knew what the apparatus meant to Danny the Dreamer, and his heart sang. It never entered his head that Buteyko might have anticipated this and taken preventive measures. But Buteyko had. He might misjudge some things, but not for 1 minute did he doubt the depths of the professor's deceit, and so before he went away he left parts on the combine complexator that were mostly worn out, some of them held together just on a wing and a prayer. New spare parts and brand new duplicates for the apparatus were hidden in a small cupboard that looked as if it contained junk. On top of them he piled all manner of paper printouts and oscillogram boxes, so that even Mutin did not think to rummage through them. He had not been working in the laboratory for quite some time, and thought he already had the best of Buteyko's equipment. How great was the professor's dismay when he discovered soon after that much of what he had raided was unfit for use. But Buteyko managed to find substitutes for almost everything that was stolen, as though with the wave of a magic wand.